There are facts you learn in school, and then there are facts that never make it anywhere near a classroom. From the businessman who built an attack helicopter from spare parts, to ramen-based prison economies, yeah, you heard me right, and even how people once paid to enter the zoo with live animals for the lions to eat. Today is gonna be interesting. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 facts too bizarre to be taught in class. 25. A Montana man rebuilt a helicopter from scrap parts. When investigators caught up with Ron Garlick in the 90s, he didn't deny a thing. He admitted that he had rebuilt a Cobra attack helicopter from surplus parts. It could fly, and that it had been armed. Once federal authorities confirmed what they were looking at, the weapons were seized and the helicopter was taken off his hands. Garlick was not charged, mostly because he cooperated and didn't try to fight the authorities. And to be fair, even stricter dismantling rules probably would not have stopped someone with his level of experience from rebuilding the helicopter. Because of that, the attention shifted away from him and toward the system that allowed it in the first place. The Pentagon tightened its demilitarization standards and reviewed how complex aircraft were broken down before being sold. 24. River otters can kill and eat young alligators. River otters may look cute and harmless, but in the wild, they sit much higher on the food chain than most people realize. In places like here in Florida, otters have been documented killing young alligators, sometimes one several feet long, and the way they do it is surprisingly calculated. An otter attacks from behind the head, clings to the gator's back, and forces it into a prolonged struggle. Alligators are built for explosive strength, not endurance. After a few minutes of rolling and thrashing, their muscles fill with lactic acid and stop working properly. The gator becomes disoriented and effectively shuts down. Once that happens, the otter drags it onto land and feeds, tearing through the hide to reach the organs and muscle. I do have to soften that fact just a little bit by also mentioning that the gator usually dies from exhaustion far before the feeding begins. But luckily, they're not being eaten alive. There's that. 23. It's possible to have two biological fathers. It usually happens when two eggs are released during the same cycle and fertilized by sperm from two different men. That creates fraternal twins with different biological fathers. Now, should one of those embryos be absorbed by the other one early in their development, the surviving fetus can grow up as a chimera, carrying two distinct genetic profiles. Different tissues in the body can contain different DNA, depending on which embryo they came from. For example, blood might tell one story, and the skin another. A confirmed example appeared in Dallas in 2009 when DNA testing showed that fraternal twins had been conceived by two different fathers. However, it remains rare enough that most doctors never encounter it, and most people who have it never even realize it. 22. The US used a Christmas song to signal the fall of Saigon. As Saigon was about to fall in April 1975 during the last days of the Vietnam War, the United States faced a delicate problem. American personnel needed to evacuate immediately, but announcing it outright risked mass panic. So they used a secret signal. Armed Forces Radio aired a calm weather report stating that the temperature was 105 degrees and rising, followed by Bing Crosby's White Christmas in Vietnam in April. Anyone listening casually would have shrugged it off, but for those in the know, the message was clear. The evacuation was live. From that point on, everything moved quickly. Evacuation sites filled, helicopters cycled in and out, and the final exit from Saigon was underway. By April 30th, more than 7,000 people had been evacuated in what became the largest helicopter evacuation in history. 21. Prison barter systems now run on ramen. Yep. Instant ramen has taken the place of cigarettes, stamps, and envelopes as the most reliable item to trade. A single packet holds steady value, does not spoil, and is always in demand, which makes it ideal for bartering. Inmates exchange ramen for extra food, hygiene items, clothing, and services like laundry or cleaning a bunk. It also shows up in gambling, card games, and informal betting pools. And the system pushed it in this direction. Prison food budgets have declined, while inmate populations have grown. Meals became smaller, quality dropped, and ramen filled the gap. It's inexpensive, high in calories, and easy to store. Inside that environment, it simply became the most practical thing to trade. 20. There's a parasitic fungus that turns flies into zombies. We still don't know whether flies are aware that they're infected, but Enomophthora muscae infects them through airborne spores that settle on their bodies during normal activity. Once inside, the fungus grows quietly and begins consuming fats and nutrients, keeping the fly alive while slowly draining it. Then, usually near sunset, the fly suddenly seeks out a high spot, clings to a surface with its mouth parts, raises its wings, and dies. Soon after, spores burst from the body and spread to other flies below. Scientists think the fungus disrupts the fly's internal clock and nervous system by sending chemical signals through its circulatory fluid. At labs like Harvard and UC Berkeley, researchers have injected fluid from infected flies into healthy ones and seen the same climbing and shutdown behavior appear. 19. One village has more elements named after it than any modern country. If you were trying to pick the most influential village in chemistry, a small village in Sweden called Ytterby probably would not look like a serious candidate. It's small, remote, and best known for a quarry that once supplied stone for porcelain. And yet, minerals taken from that one site led scientists to identify 7 new chemical elements over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. 4 of them were named directly after the village itself: yttrium, terbium, erbium, and ytterbium. The remaining 3 were also isolated from rare earth-rich minerals found in the same quarry, including gadolinium, which was named after the chemist Johann Gadolin, who identified the first of them. 18. A Ming emperor personally commanded a disaster. In 1449, the Zheng Tong Emperor marched north with a massive Ming army to confront Mongol forces under Etienne Taishi, the leader of the Oirat Mongols. The Ming army seemed unbeatable, with records saying it had hundreds of thousands of soldiers, while the Mongols had only tens of thousands. However, at Tumu, the Ming army fell apart. They were cut off, became disorganized, and were almost completely destroyed. The emperor was captured. Writers at the time tried to describe how big the loss was, saying the number of dead and missing soldiers was as large as the population of whole kingdoms. The exact numbers are still debated, but the dynasty only survived because officials like Yu Qian quickly organized the defense, rebuilt the army, and protected the capital until the Mongols left. 17. Someone gave a Soviet monument a SpongeBob makeover. In 2016, a Soviet-era war monument in the Russian city of Voronezh became famous for all the wrong reasons. Someone, or maybe several someones, repainted it to look like Patrick Star from SpongeBob SquarePants. Photos of the remade statue spread quickly, and people's reactions were split almost immediately. Most people laughed it off as a practical joke, while others saw it as vandalism. Local authorities investigated the event and ultimately restored the monument to its former glory, but as we all know, the internet never forgets. 16. There's a US town named after a quiz show. In the 50s, a popular quiz show called Truth or Consequences, hosted by Ralph Edwards, announced that it would broadcast its anniversary episode from the first town willing to rename itself after the program. Hot Springs in New Mexico took the deal. The name change was made official, and the show was aired in the town. The publicity worked so well that the name stuck. Edwards kept returning for years. In fact, several public spaces were eventually named after him, including a downtown park and civic buildings, and the town turned the whole thing into an annual festival that still happens today. Truth or Consequences sits along the Rio Grande and is still known for its mineral hot springs, bathhouses, historic buildings, and annual events tied to the original 1950 broadcast. 15. Elmer Fudd started out as a wildlife photographer. When Elmer Fudd first appeared in the early Looney Tunes cartoons, he was not a hunter at all. In those first shorts, Elmer actually headed into the countryside carrying a camera, hoping to photograph animals in their natural habitats. Unfortunately, that version of the character didn't last long. His first run-ins with Bugs Bunny quickly went off the rails, and in true Looney Tunes style, Bugs mocked him, sabotaged everything he tried to do, and pushed him into a series of humiliating failures that ultimately ended with Elmer jumping into a lake and almost drowning. After that, the camera disappeared. When Elmer returned, he was carrying a rifle and had become openly obsessed with wabbit hunting instead. 14. Ernest Hemingway's child underwent gender reassignment surgery. Gregory Hemingway, born 1931, was famed writer Ernest Hemingway's youngest child. Over the course of her life, Gregory came to live largely as a woman under the name Gloria, a reality that deeply strained her relationship with her father. The breaking point in the two's relationship came in 1951 when Gloria was arrested for attempting to enter a woman's restroom. Ernest was beyond angry. To make things worse, Gloria's mother suddenly died from an adrenal tumor just a few hours later, and Ernest placed the blame squarely on his child. The years that followed were marked by instability. Gloria attended a medical school, became a physician, struggled with heavy drinking, lost her license, and went through several marriages. In 1995, she underwent gender reassignment surgery and thereafter used both Gregory and Gloria as names, depending on the context. 13. People built pyramids in the Americas at the same time as people in Egypt. When people talk about ancient pyramids, the conversation usually jumps straight to Egypt. But around 2600 BCE, pyramids were also being built in coastal Peru by the Caral civilization. Caral was more than just a small settlement or ceremonial site. It was a carefully planned city with large pyramid complexes, sunken circular plazas, wide staircases, and homes spread over 1,500 acres. The largest pyramid is nearly 100 feet tall and covers an area about the size of several football fields. Radiocarbon dating places Caral firmly between about 3000 and 1800 BCE, so it's the oldest known urban center in the Americas, complete with monumental architecture thousands of years before the rise of the better-known Inca Empire. 12. Some rainbows can look almost completely red. A rainbow doesn't actually need all 7 colors to show up. What it really needs is sunlight, moisture in the air, and the right angles between them. Early in the morning or late in the evening, the sun sits low on the horizon, and its light has to push through a much thicker layer of atmosphere than it does at midday. That long trip filters out a lot of the blue and green light along the way. By the time the light reaches falling rain, most of what's left are the longer wavelengths, especially reds and oranges. Those colors still bend and reflect inside raindrops, so the rainbow shape forms like normal, just without the full spectrum. So, to someone seeing one for the first time, it can actually look more like a faint red arc than a traditional rainbow. 11. Post offices are legally required to fly the POW MIA flag. Most people walk past the POW MIA flag at the post office without giving it much thought, but it's there for a very specific reason. Federal law requires the U.S. Postal Service to fly that flag whenever the American flag is up at one of its buildings. It's a mandate because lawmakers wanted the issue of prisoners of war and those missing in action kept in plain sight, woven into everyday routines instead of limited to Memorial Days or military spaces. Post offices made sense because they're federal, widespread, and visited by millions of people every day. The flag has to be clearly visible and treated with the same respect and consideration as the national flag next to it. 10. Cybercrime now rivals traditional black markets. Cybercrime has become one of the most lucrative criminal industries in the modern world. In the US alone, estimates put the financial damage in the hundreds of billions of dollars each year, rivaling, or even exceeding, the money generated by the domestic drug trade. The difference is how that money is made. Drug trafficking depends on physical supply chains, transportation, and constant exposure to law enforcement. Cybercrime doesn't. A ransomware crew can operate from anywhere with an internet connection, target victims across the globe, and disappear just as fast. Scams that take minutes to launch can wipe out personal savings or cripple businesses overnight. Because the operations are digital, criminals can automate large parts of the process and reach far more victims than traditional crime ever could. 9. Delousing used to be a routine part of social life. Our modern ideas about cleanliness don't really match how people lived day to day in medieval times. Lice were common back then. Not because people were necessarily dirty or anything like that, but because the living conditions made it hard to avoid them. People didn't bathe often, clothes were costly and worn over and over, and families shared crowded homes. Because of this, getting rid of lice was something people had to do regularly, and they often did it together instead of alone. People would sit together picking lice out of their hair or clothes one at a time. Since it took a while, they would talk and make it a social activity instead of a quiet task. Some records even show that a few enterprising people offered delousing as a paid service, much like helping with laundry or repairs. 8. Wounded Foreign Legion soldiers can apply for French citizenship. The French Foreign Legion has a tradition that sets it apart from almost every other military force in the world. Foreign volunteers who are wounded in combat while serving France can apply for French citizenship under a principle commonly referred to as Français par le sang versé, which roughly translates to French by spilled blood. Kind of poetic, isn't it? The Legion has always welcomed outsiders, men who joined under the French flag, even though they were born somewhere else. Letting wounded soldiers apply for citizenship early strengthens that connection. It also makes the Legion one of the few modern groups where military service can actually change someone's legal identity, not just their career or personal story. Getting injured doesn't guarantee citizenship, but it does push their application to the front of the line. 7. A child landowner struck oil and changed history. Sarah Rector was born in 1902 to a working-class African-American family in what was then Indian Territory. Like many children at the time, she received a land allotment through a federal program that divided tribal lands into individual plots. On paper, her 80 acres in the Creek Nation looked ordinary and fairly unpromising. Then, oil was discovered beneath it. When Sarah was just 11, her land began producing oil so quickly that she became a millionaire almost overnight. Her royalty payments soon became larger than what most adults see in the area earned. Newspapers across the country reported on how a black child had suddenly become one of the richest people in Oklahoma. However, that wealth came with complications. Because of her age and race, courts placed her finances under white guardianship, and her life became heavily supervised. Be that as it may, an oil strike turned her into a millionaire before she was even a teenager, in an era where that almost never happened. 6. George Washington exploited a residency law to avoid emancipation. Pennsylvania's gradual abolition law was designed to chip away at slavery by freeing enslaved people who lived in the state long enough. That put George Washington in an uncomfortable position when he moved to Philadelphia as president. If the enslaved people in his household stayed too long, they would legally be entitled to freedom. So, he ordered that they be sent out of state before reaching that 6-month limit, then brought them back later, restarting the legal timeline each time, effectively blocking emancipation without openly defying the law. Washington even instructed that these transfers be handled discreetly so they wouldn't attract public attention. 5. People once paid to enter the zoo with live animals. The first version of what later became the London Zoo was very different from the zoos we know today. In the 1700s, the animal collection at the Tower of London functioned more as a spectacle than an institution. Admission was cheap, but if someone couldn't afford it, they might still be allowed in by providing food for the animals instead. In some cases, that meant bringing a live animal to feed the lions. Public feedings were very popular, and people didn't worry much about the animals, whether they were the hunters or the ones being eaten. Over time, though, people's views changed, thankfully, and by the early 1800s, the practices eventually stopped. 4. Certain wasps never sat right with Darwin. Charles Darwin once said that parasitic wasps were one of the hardest things for him to accept in a world that was supposed to be carefully designed and kind. He found ichneumoniid wasps especially disturbing because they lay their eggs inside living caterpillars. I don't want to get too graphic, but when the larvae hatch, they begin eating the host from the inside, carefully avoiding vital organs so the caterpillar stays alive as long as possible. Darwin wrote that he couldn't believe a kind and all-powerful God would have created such a system. However, this idea didn't make him lose his faith right away, as some stories suggest, but it stayed with him. He often thought about it when he struggled to understand suffering in nature. For him, the issue wasn't death itself, but the slow and intentional process that was part of these insects' lives. 3. Some Swiss towns let residents vote on new citizens. In Switzerland, citizenship isn't decided by one national office. Instead, the process is very local, and the town where a person lives can make the final decision. Applicants must meet federal and cantonal rules, but they also need to show their town that they fit in. In the past, that sometimes meant facing a direct vote by local residents. Neighbors could literally decide whether someone should be granted citizenship. In a few well-documented cases, applications were actually rejected for reasons that had nothing to do with criminal records or language ability. People got turned down for being seen as unfriendly, for not greeting neighbors often enough, or for failing to take part in local traditions. 2. The world's rarest blood type is known as golden blood. People with Rh null blood lack every Rh antigen, a combination so uncommon that only a few dozen people with it have ever been documented. Because of that, the blood is medically priceless. It can be used in transfusions for patients with complex Rh incompatibilities who have no other safe options. But at the same time, having Rh null blood puts the donor in a vulnerable position. They cannot accept blood from almost anyone else. In an emergency, only another Rh null donor will do. Because of this, people with Rh null blood often need to be extra careful. Some even store their own blood ahead of time in case they need it for future medical treatments. 1. Photosynthesis can happen without sunlight. Photosynthesis has always been treated as a strictly solar-powered process. Then, scientists started looking more closely at bacteria living near deep-sea hydrothermal vents. In those deep waters, sunlight never gets through, but the vents give off heat as infrared energy. Despite that, there are still some bacteria that have special pigments capable of absorbing these faint infrared photons. Rather than using sunlight, they use the Earth's heat. The energy they get is small, so it works together with chemical reactions involving sulfur instead of replacing them. Still, this process challenged a long-held idea in biology. It proved that light-based energy systems can work even in complete darkness, as long as there's heat. This discovery also raised an uncomfortable question. If life can do that here on Earth, it could also survive on other planets that have heat but no actual sunlight. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and making it all the way to the end. If this list hit all the right notes for you, you will love 25 bizarre mutations that defy science. It's all about the wacky DNA changes that had to happen before humans ever showed up, including the energy boost inside our cells and the changes that let us turn wild plants into food. The link for that one will appear right about here. And as always, should you want to support the channel, liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing, doing all that stuff will go a long way. I really, really appreciate you guys being here, and I'll see you next time. Bye.